Ronnie Chaudhary. I'm the Director of Center for Connected Multimodal Mobility. We are glad to have today Dr. Jennifer Ogle. She will be giving a presentation as our distinguished speaker on the assessment of safety benefits of technologies to reduce pedestrian crossing fatalities at mid-block locations. So she is a professor and associate chair of civil engineering at Clemson University. And Dr. Jennifer Ogle has over 24 years of combined research and academic experience in highway safety performance measurement, infrastructure design and management, human factors, accessibility and vulnerable road users, as well as advanced data collection methods. She received her PhD in civil engineering from Georgia Tech in civil and environmental engineering with a minor in engineering psychology and human factors. Dr. Ogle has conducted research for NCHRP on new technologies for improving safety data. And she has conducted multiple projects for SCDOT or South Carolina DOT. These projects include asset data collection, safety measures, clear zones, and incident management initiatives. Dr. Ogle's scholarship has advanced data accuracy and completeness through innovations in data collection techniques and technologies. She was also involved in the development of training materials, workshop activities, and co-facilitation of the roadway data improvement program. She was a founding facilitator for the program. And also she worked very closely with the North Carolina DOT on different safety initiatives. Her publications based on extensive empirical data have been nationally utilized, and those advocated for legislation against texting and driving in the country as well as in our state, South Carolina. So her work supported stringent graduated licensing laws and relocation of trees in roadside clear zones, as well as drive policy changes for more efficient and safer roadway infrastructure. Dr. Ogle is presently a member of the Highway Safety Performance Committee and chair of the Joint Subcommittee of the International Safety Performance Research for the National Academy of Sciences of the Transportation Research Board. She has organized 3 international workshops in the last 3 years on transferring safety performance research to other developed nations as well as to lower and middle income countries. So it is our pleasure to welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. Jennifer Ogle.
Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary, for that introduction. Before I get started today, let me move my microphone a little bit closer. Before I get started today, I would like to just recognize Sababa Islam as kind of a key contributor to this project. Most of the research and charts and things that you'll see in this presentation were created by Sababa. So I owe a lot of credit to all the work that's done here to her. So just wanted to make that recognition up front. Get on the right screen so I can click. Okay, so thinking about the problem of pedestrian safety as we kind of start moving into a world with autonomous vehicles. Last year, there were just under 7,000 pedestrians killed in the United States. And if you look at the trend of what's happening with pedestrian crashes, pedestrian fatalities have been increasing from 2009 to 2019 at about 60%. So that is a huge change in just a period of 10 years. In 2018, and kind of as I'm thinking back, South Carolina has been in the top 5, no less than the top 10 of states who are ranked in highest in pedestrian fatalities per 100,000 population. We were ranked 5th in 2018. And so not a statistic that you want to rank highly in, but knowing that we do, it's important to learn about that, understand why, and learn how to take some action. So as we think about where we are going with autonomous vehicles, there's a lot of talk and a lot of speculation that crash frequencies can be dramatically reduced when all vehicles have collision avoidance, lane departure warnings, side view assistance, adaptive headlights, and automatic braking system. And the reason that these speculations are made is because it takes the decision and the reaction time basically away from the driver. And so it removes some of those components of potential driver error. There was a report on autonomous vehicle research that's kind of a compilation of research. And one of the quotes that they made in there is that crashes will drop by 70% in 25 years with this adoption. But the question still exists. What about pedestrian errors? And so the vehicles will be driven by computers, but the pedestrians are still going to be driving themselves. And so kind of case in point, looking back, an autonomous Uber crash, which most everyone's probably familiar with. The crash happened at night in a mid-block section of roadway on a multi-lane facility. And the pedestrian that was struck was actually crossing the road from the left. And the self-driving Uber vehicle, the perception module of the vehicle got confused in detecting, was it a pedestrian or was it a bicycle? Because the pedestrian was actually pushing the bicycle across the street. And so herein lies one of the problems. One, this is not a normal crossing location for any pedestrian. And so when we think about decision-making systems and detection, there is some expectation that's built into decision-making, and even self-expectation within us as drivers. We don't expect pedestrians to be coming from the left in the middle of a mid-block section. We might expect to see them on the right-hand side of the road walking on a sidewalk, but definitely not in the middle of the road at this particular location. So why did the pedestrian cross here? That's a really good question. Looks like it might have been a long distance to the next intersection. Maybe they thought that they were going to be able to safely get across. Maybe they thought that the driver of the vehicle saw them and would slow down and stop. Those are all questions that we will never know about this particular case. Also, in thinking about CAV adoption, there's going to be a continuum for a good number of years. It takes a really long time to infiltrate the vehicle fleet with new technology, sometimes upwards of 10 to 15 years, in fact. One, because of the cost of the new technologies in the vehicles, but two, people are holding on to their vehicles longer and longer. Average vehicle life expectancy is over 10 years now. So there's a lot that's going on. And so we have to think about that as we are rolling out systems and expecting benefits to occur from those. So our goal, this was planned as a two-phase project. So the goal of the first piece was basically to assemble and analyze data that will help us develop simulation scenarios for CAV detection and response for pedestrians. The second part of that was to basically do those simulations. So this was kind of like the first piece to pull a lot of the data and the understanding together. So within this, we had three different objectives that we were going after. One was identifying the pedestrian crash trends and infrastructure factors for South Carolina. Another one was establishing parameters to identify, were there any specific vulnerable groups within the pedestrian population? And then also to assess infrastructure detection technologies for prevalent conditions. So what types of roads, what types of environmental situations were these crashes occurring in? So we started this and we had multiple different pieces. And the first piece that we looked at was pedestrian crash analysis. And we used an expert assessment and a manual procedure. And I'll tell you why. So what we wanted to do was to really kind of like understand why crashes occur. So we did a lot of research of prior literature and research done by others. And there were two kind of key papers that set us forward on a path for what we wanted to do with our project. Olson and Sivak, 1996, studied nighttime pedestrian visibility. And so they found that the driver's ability to visually detect pedestrians depends on lots of factors. It depends on the weather, the driver's age, how well they deal with light adaptation, so going from dark to light and vice versa. Their vehicle headlights, any roadway lighting. And through all of that, basically what they found, the average detection distances for young and older drivers are listed over here. And let me see if I can get the highlighter out. And so if you look at an individual dressed in white, young driver can see them or detect them at about 81 meters. Whereas if you look at an older driver over 65 years old, that drops down to 35 meters. So that's a huge difference. And so older drivers have a much shorter detection distance than younger drivers. And herein lies the problems with humans. We have very unreliable systems. So the other research project was done by Schneider and Stefanich, 2016, and this basically introduced a method for classifying pedestrian movements. So they classified 296 pedestrian crashes, and they looked at the location relative to an intersection. So was it an intersection or was it in a roadway segment? Then they also looked at the direction of the pedestrian movement relative to the motor vehicle. So if the motor vehicle was going straight down the roadway, was the pedestrian walking along the roadway? Was it crossing? Was it doing something else? Was it working on a vehicle? So there were lots of different codings. So they came up with 20 different coding schemes for pedestrian maneuvers. And I would say that we actually developed our crash coding scheme before we identified this paper. This paper helped us kind of think about it and put it into some more precise categories. But it was interesting how closely our research and this research fell. So what we did in this process, we basically collected crash reports, crash databases, and all the different roadway inventory files. And then we set out to manually code crashes and conduct trend analysis to understand what the crash patterns were. Then we developed an automated code for quantitative analysis so that we could run that same detailed manual process on large databases. And then we went through with quantitative analysis of the crash data from the crash databases. Crash data analysis, as I mentioned, kind of took a two-pronged approach. So our qualitative analysis was done for 2 years, 2014 and 15. We used both the police crash report forms for South Carolina as well as Google Earth to do our analysis. The second part, where we kind of got into the coding and looked at larger databases, we used 2007 to 2018, so a much longer period of data. And we looked at the crash databases and the roadway inventory database that SCDOT contains. For this research, we basically used 4 primary coding categories. The first coding category are pedestrians walking along the road. The second coding category are pedestrians are crossing at midblock. And so in this case, you see both the vehicle and the pedestrian are going in the same direction. And in this one, they're going in opposite directions. So we had ped along same and ped along opposite. For the crossing, we had the pedestrian crossing from the right of the approaching vehicle and from the left of the approaching vehicle. And so you'll see that those kind of categories again and again as we go through this research. So we received from the DOT a large number of, or actually all of the fatal pedestrian crash reports. Those tend to have the most data or the most complete of all of the crash reports. And so we looked at all those fatal crashes for a period of about 2 years. And I want to say there were roughly 90 in each year. So we did about 200 fatal crashes. And the reason for doing this was to basically identify the factors that we thought were important, but then also to make sure that we had a good coding and we could check what we were automating within the coding for the databases with our manual work. And so we basically did these in 2 batches. We did 1 year and had a couple of, Sababa and I basically coded these individually. We compared all of our codes. We would talk through and walk through why we did or didn't match and kind of clarified and tweaked our coding. And then we moved on to the next set. So after that, we were actually able to then put together a bunch of infrastructure elements, and we did a manual qualitative analysis of all of the infrastructure, or not all of the, a good number of pieces of infrastructure at each of the crash sites. And so we looked at the presence of light poles, the presence of sidewalks, the number of lanes, median type, median width, and we did all of that looking specifically at those sites in Google Earth Pro. And so these are all of the sites that we looked at. And basically for each site, we pulled that up on Google Earth and coded things like 2 lanes. We looked at the width of the lanes. We looked at whether or not they had light posts in the area. So lots of data collected through that process. A bit time consuming. You can ask Sabab all about that. So the results, and again, we have results for things other than our 4 kind of scenarios, but I want to focus on our 4 scenarios for the results. So we looked at the percent distribution of crashes for the direction of travel. And so what you see is we have and this is for 2 years, so 2014 and 15. And so in 2014, 30% were ped along same, 5% were ped along opposite, and 7 and 16% were basically crossing type crashes from the right and from the left. And you notice that this kind of varies from year to year quite a bit. And so we had a lot more percentage of those crossing crashes from the left in 2015, and a lot less of the ped along same direction in 2015. But when we started to look at some of the characteristics, those really started to hone in and look very similar. So we saw some really good trends. When you are looking at walking along the roadway, there are a number of light poles, or a number of sites that don't have light poles present, very few that do. And so when you're looking at the crossing, again, light poles not present is the predominant situation, but there are a number of situations where we do have light poles, more so than for crashes walking along. Presence of sidewalk was also a factor. And so what you see here is that walking along crashes tended to not have sidewalks present. And that makes sense. If someone's going to get hit by a vehicle walking along the road, chances are they're walking in the road and not on the sidewalk. And it makes sense that if a sidewalk is not present, more people will be walking in the road. Whereas when you're looking at crossing type crashes, there did tend to be more sidewalks present than sidewalks not present. And so that kind of, that trend, or at least kind of equal numbers of sidewalks present and not present, and that trend, again, stayed the same. In terms of number of lanes, when we look at those crashes where pedestrians are walking along the road, most of those were occurring on a small number of lanes. So 2 lanes, a few of them on 4-lane roadways. But then when you look at the crossing type crashes, more of these are occurring on the 4- and 6-lane roadways. And so crossing crashes are tending to be more in that urban, suburban, larger road facility. So that was kind of all of the stuff that we learned from that manual process. But we used that manual process then to kind of carry over to a quantitative process. So moving from, looking at things from a qualitative standpoint, we still did quantitative in the other, but really kind of more from trying to figure out what we wanted to do to looking at large databases in a more automated way. So moving to that qualitative analysis, we took the results from that manual analysis that we did, and we looked through what information we had in the crash databases and in the roadway inventory, and we started to develop automation code so that we could go through and code all of the crashes in the database the same way that we had done with the crash reports. And then we ran the automation code to get the direction of travel of the PED with respect to the vehicle. Then we separated out nighttime fatal crashes and also assigned direction for walking and crossing crashes. And then the last piece was basically pulling out all of those mid-block crashes. And so we did a spatial join for that. And these are kind of steps that we learned along the way. One of the things that I will point out is we spent a lot of time looking at dark conditions. And so the first time that we ran this, we did whether or not the police report said dark or light conditions. And then later on, we actually went in and did a more thorough review and used sunrise, sunset, and even looked at the kind of twilight periods to see if there were any differences. So from a quality control standpoint, it was really important that we were able to get a very high percentage of our quantitative analysis to match what we found in the qualitative analysis. And so when we went back and did a comparison, we had about 84% match between those two data sets where we had both our analysis and the same set of crashes doing the automation. One of the things that was very interesting is that when we went back and did a check on some of these, the automation actually seemed to be a little bit better because it was using more of the coding that was present in the crash database that wasn't necessarily written up in the sections of the report that we were looking at. And so it wasn't written in the police officer's description of the crash or in the crash diagram. So that was kind of interesting. We actually ended up processing a lot more data in the quantitative analysis than we even did in our qualitative analysis. So what this allowed us to do was really look at a huge number of crashes. And so overall, we had about a little over 1 million crashes in the database that we looked at. Again, that was over about a 10-year period. There were roughly 0.7% crashes, so 7,656 pedestrian crashes, of which about 13% were fatal. And so we have kind of focused on the fatal crashes, but we've gone back and done some work on the injury and still a lot of the same types of patterns with severe injuries as well as fatalities. So with the fatalities, we looked at and separated out the daytime crashes, which were just under 20%, and really focused on the nighttime crashes because those were the bulk of the majority of the fatal pedestrian crashes, at 80%. Then we separated those again further between nighttime intersection and nighttime mid-block crashes. Again, you see those mid-block crashes for the fatalities being the predominant 85%. From there, we took those crashes and looked at walking versus crossing, other and unknown. And we really focused on the walking and crossing because those were occurring in the walkway. There were some other crashes where vehicles were pulled off to the side of the road. People were changing tires and things. And those were not necessarily interactions between pedestrians and vehicles in a normal operation. And so that was kind of where the bulk of our focus was. So number and severity of crashes in South Carolina, we basically saw kind of a starting and ending trend. We were declining in total numbers of pedestrian crashes for a few years at the beginning of this period, and obviously a very clear trend of increasing crashes as we are coming out of this period. And we're still seeing that trend of increasing continue. So then we looked at day versus nighttime conditions. And again, we already saw that 80% of the crashes were nighttime and 20% day. And that was pretty consistent throughout the time period. Midblock versus intersection. Again, midblock, we saw overall about 85%. And again, that was consistent throughout the time period. And then for our quantitative analysis, we also looked at infrastructure information, but this time we were limited to what was in the South Carolina Department of Transportation Roadway Inventory Management System. And there we had things like route type, which is, whether or not it's an interstate or a local road, route division, whether or not it had a median divide, median type, median width, land use, total number of lanes. We also pulled from the crash data and kind of looked at that, the clothing of the pedestrian. And no surprise, clothing of the pedestrian was typically dark, no reflective properties. And again, all of that was automatically kind of pulled and meshed with the crash data. So looking at the pedestrian maneuvers for fatal pedestrian midblock crashes at night by route type. And so it starts with US interstate, goes to US routes, then we have major and minor arterials and collectors, or local roads, sorry. And so as you see these, the first two are pedestrians walking along the side of the road. And so we see a lot of secondary or local type roads in that category. And so that is really going to be more of your 2-lane road type scenarios. So that makes sense. In the crossing type crashes, we see a lot of US routes. So these are going to be more of your major arterials, so more numbers of lanes. And again, that's what we saw when we did the manual analysis. So all of this kind of makes sense, and it doesn't really change much. One thing I did want to point out is the majority of the pedestrian from left crashes are occurring on those US routes, which are going to be more of your major arterials. So these are much larger roads. Then we had maneuvers by route division. And so whether or not the road was divided or not divided. And so as you can see, most of the roads were not divided, although we do see some division here, a little bit more so in the pedestrians who are crossing the road type crashes. So we looked a little bit deeper into that, and what we found was kind of interesting. And so most of our walking along the road crashes were non-divided facilities. But then when we looked at the type of divide for the crossing type crashes, what we found was that a bunch of them were multi-lane bituminous median. What that means is it's a paved median, and we often see these as 2-way left turn lanes. And so pedestrians are trying to cross the road on a large multi-lane facility. They get to that 2-way left turn lane, get stuck, but then they are now sitting ducks waiting for vehicles to turn in or out of that lane, which is a very unsafe place to be in a roadway. Here we'll look at it by the total number of lanes. Again, so this is looking at percentage of crashes in our 4 different categories. And we see that our ped right and ped left, so our crossing type crashes, again, are going to be more on the 4, 5 and more lanes, and more of the walking along are on the 2-lane facilities. In terms of rural and urban, most of the crossing type crashes, again, are going to be in the urban area, whereas there's a much closer, more even split when we're looking at the walking along type crashes, where most of those are kind of relatively evenly split around 50%. Now, so that was kind of all the crash data analysis. The second thing that we wanted to do was look at the socio-demographic patterns or socio-demographics of our pedestrians who were involved in the crashes. So we weren't really concerned about the drivers that hit them. We were concerned about who are these individuals and do they have any characteristics that are common amongst individuals who are more likely to be hit than others. So we pulled together a GIS-based census data analysis of crash-involved pedestrians, and so that's what I'll walk you through next. So for this, we collected data. So we pulled all of our fatal and injury nighttime pedestrian crash records, and we pulled the pedestrian home location for all of those. About 7% were missing home location, but we got a good number of those crashes. Then we went about geolocating or geocoding their home location. So we had to clean and prepare the home location information, and then we figured out basically where those pedestrians lived. From there, we were able to take the census block group data from prior census and mesh that with that home location. And so now we know where the pedestrian crash occurred, we know where the pedestrian's home location was, and we know the predominant socio-demographic characteristics of that home location from the census data. Things like median income and education level of the individuals that live in that particular block group. From there, we summarized all the socio-demographics for all the pedestrians who were involved in crashes at night. And then one last step that we did, you've always heard that people are involved in crashes closer to their home. And so we kind of did a proximity analysis between the pedestrian home location and the crash location. So ultimately, we geocoded over 90% of the home locations of the pedestrians who were involved in severe pedestrian crashes. And so you can see some of the breakdowns there. There were 14% fatal crashes and 77% injury crashes. There were some PDO crashes, but we didn't really analyze those because we were looking more at the severe types of injuries. We also got rid of the daytime crashes. Again, some of the injury crashes were more of those were daytime crashes than the fatal crashes. More of those were nighttime crashes. But anyway, that kind of walks you through how we did the street address and the 9 or 5-digit zip code information checks. So we did use both of those in trying to determine the geocoding of those crash sites or the home locations of the pedestrians involved in crashes. So next was basically appending the census block data to the crash data or to the crash pedestrian file. And so we used the block group boundaries in an Esri shapefile and populated with the 2010 census data for South Carolina. That allowed us to summarize everything. So we kind of summarized a lot of different socio-demographic characteristics and categories, population, gender, race, ethnicity, age, and we included several variables, including median household educational attainment, percent in poverty, number of vehicles that they have available in their household, and vehicle age. And then we did 2 different types of analysis. We looked at whether or not there was any significant trend in socio-demographic characteristics based on the distance between the home and crash location. And then we looked at that home and crash location to tie things together. So here's a summary of the socio-demographic analysis. one of the things that you'll see here, and I'll try to point out a few things. When we look at the pedestrians and we kind of compared the pedestrians who were involved in crashes to the state average, and if you see a star beside this, it means that there's a significant difference at 95% confidence interval level. And so population density for pedestrians involved in crashes, they tend to live in more dense areas than do versus the population density average at the state level. Their household income is also quite a bit lower than the state average. We have more in poverty and more in the lower no high school or high school only educational attainment levels. Again, all of those were significantly different. The other thing that we see is that there is a higher percentage of African Americans, fewer Caucasians, and slightly more Hispanic pedestrians involved in crashes. There was not a huge amount of difference with the average vehicle age and vehicles available per household. In terms of the home to crash distance by range, this was really interesting because we kind of set out asking that question, do people really get involved in crashes when they're closer to home? If you take a look at this table, it would suggest that yes, they do. That about 50% of the pedestrians who were involved in crashes were hit within about a half-mile range of their home. If you add to that those within 5 miles, that's almost 75% of all the crashes are going to occur within 5 miles of the home. So that's pretty interesting information. And then we also kind of looked at the fatal and injury pedestrian socio-demographic by home to crash distance. And here, where we look at these distances between the pedestrian's home and the crash location, kind of hone in on this. Remember, this is the majority of the crashes are going to occur in that half-mile range. And if you look at the average median household income, that is the lowest of all of the different range distances. And so to me, what that says is we do have an issue with lower socioeconomic status individuals. And so looking at where we have lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods and groupings, we should be taking a look at what is going on with the roadway and the pedestrian facilities in those areas. Again, you also see some slight differences in Caucasian African American percents and Hispanic. Again, Hispanic is higher than most others, African American is higher than most others, and Caucasian is lower. And so again, there are some issues there as well. And the vehicle age and vehicles available per household, again, really do not differ that very much by these groups. So the last thing that we wanted to do is kind of understand how easy would it be to go out in the field and collect data on corridors to detect pedestrians crossing during nighttime at these mid-block locations, because right now there's not a good source of data for that. And so if we're going to kind of move into another level of data analysis, understanding how often that occurs is really important. And so we did a field test and looked at some night vision autoscope cameras versus some infrared cameras. And what we found is that any sort of test to look for pedestrian activity at night is going to have a little bit more robust infrared camera to do anything worth doing. And so we set up a site here on campus, looked at pedestrian detection with night vision camera and a dark not lit section. We also looked at using an infrared camera in a dark not lit section. And then we had vehicles there, and we turned the lights on one of the vehicles and used the vehicle light to light up that section of road. It was a really dark night. I think we had about a quarter moon available. And so not a lot of extra light, and none of these facilities out here really have big parking lights or anything that would have caused light pollution. We set up the test with our cameras mounted at about 15 feet on our transportation van. And we had, again, the infrared camera and an autoscope camera or autoscope type camera. Then we looked at 8 different crossing locations. The first couple were at 25-foot increments, and then we go from 50 to 100 to 150, all the way out to 300. And so there are the vendors for the cameras, power consumption, and the mounting heights were both the same. We had a number of our graduate students. So a shout out to Dr. Sarah Sua, Feng Shao, Nassim, Jared, and I think that's Leo in the biomotion suit. And so all of them kind of came out and took a bunch of nice long walks with us for the evening. But we had an orange reflective vest, a yellow reflective vest, a white sweatshirt with dark pants, all black clothing. And we improvised a biomotion suit using reflective tape, and we wrapped it around the wrists, elbows, and shoulders, knees of Leo. And then we had them walk back and forth across the road at all those intervals. And so we had set out cones all the way down so that they would know where to cross. And so wanted to show you kind of a few pictures that indicate kind of what we saw when, and sorry, these aren't huge pictures, but you can kind of get the idea. At 200 feet, this is the top one is the orange vest. And when you're looking at this on a computer, you can see something out here that's a blip in the middle of the road, but is not really discernible to be a pedestrian shape. However, when you look at the infrared image, you can see, you know, fairly clearly some white pedestrians sitting out here on the edge of the road. For black clothing, there was absolutely nothing that was visible in dark, not lit conditions. But again, you could still see with the infrared image, that person walking across the road pretty clearly. Then we had our situation where we turned on the vehicle headlights of one of the vehicles that was on the site. And we, again, did the same type of test where the students and Sarah Sewell walked back and forth across the road in a big serpent pattern. And this is the same station, 2+00. And so again, the orange vest is crossing, and you can see that person crossing. Actually can see more of their legs crossing than the vest, but nonetheless. And then with the infrared camera, again, you can see it almost same as you would have in the no lighting condition. And then and in fact, I think you might be able to see it better because of the contrast without the lighting. And then again, with the orange vest, you've got that out there, and you can see it pretty clear. I don't know why I have 2 orange vests. There was supposed to be a black situation. So sorry, but you could see it, and you could see it with the headlights at 200 feet. So ultimately, we had the summary of our field test showed that the dark not lit condition with our infrared camera, you could see pretty much everything. Where you see yes, no, you could see a little bit of something, but it was not really discernible. And then no's and yeses. So biomotion by far did the best in the night vision camera. Infrared, again, always pretty good. One of the other things that we captured pretty clearly in this test was a headlight illumination pattern that not a lot of people really know exist. And so when you look at the headlights from a vehicle, the right light is positioned where it extends out and kind of over to the right-hand side, so it illuminates the side of the road well for pedestrians that along a sidewalk. However, when you look at the left-hand side, it is kind of out and down over toward the left, and the key there is you're trying to reduce the glare for oncoming vehicles. And so in this particular case, it's just a really good way to show that illumination pattern. And so we have this theory that pedestrians who are approaching from the left are basically not seen as well because of this headlight illumination pattern. And that has actually been tested in prior research and concluded. So I will leave you with this and kind of thinking about what do we do with all this information? And I would say, you know, we're trying to take those environmental conditions, the socio-demographics, and the infrastructure type, and defining a contextually aware metric or index for use with CAVs. And so if we can identify sections of road where we see potential importance of the combination of these factors, it could be really helpful in identifying locations along the roadway where CAVs should be more aware of potential pedestrian movements and involvement. So that's where we are now. And at this time, I will be happy to take any questions that you've got. All right, no questions. Everybody's speechless. That was just so good, wasn't it?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ogle. We definitely appreciate your time. And if anyone does have any further questions, feel free to reach out to us at the Center for Connected Multimodal Mobility. We're happy to pass those on to Dr. Ogle. And then as with all of our webinars, this has been recorded and will go up on our YouTube and website and all our other social media. So this will be a continuing resource if you want to come back to it.
Great, thanks so much. And hello to so many of our students out there. I see very many of you. So happy Thursday.
And thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.